So welcome everyone, and I should first start by asking everybody to switch off their mics and cameras if you wish. If you do not wish to be recorded, that's all we need. It is to switch off mics and cameras. Otherwise, of course, feel free to participate. This is yet another session as part of the Living Memory of Cities series that we've been organizing at Eric Parry Architects with the Centre for Urban and Built Ecologies at London Met. And Matthew Barac, I can see on my screen, should be saying a few words, a few notices after this. Eric, we can also see on our screen, Eric Parry will be chairing the session as always, and then that would be followed by William's presentation. That should last about 35-36 minutes as a rough estimate, and that would then be followed by questions and answers, another 30 minutes or so. So in total, the session should be no more than 1 hour or so. For questions, Christian Frost, Nick Temple, if you wishes, and Matthew may start the questions before Eric passes it on, opens it to the floor. But of course, please by all means do click on the hand on the top right of your screen if you wish to intervene or ask a question, and that will be taken in due course. That's all for me, and I'll pass it on to Matthew for any notices and to welcome everybody on behalf of London Met.
Thank you very much. Yes, no, not at all much from me, except to say, of course, welcome from the perspective of the School of Art, Architecture and Design at London Metropolitan. This has been a great series so far, our collaboration with Eric Parry Architects, and really brought an extended family together. So it's great to welcome you all again. I have also, for those of you who are interested in future events, put the link to the program in the chat bar. If you have any questions about it, do visit the London Metropolitan University School of Art, Architecture and Design website and go to see our research centre, the Centre for Urban and Built Ecologies Cube, where details are available. So now I'll hand over to Eric, who will introduce William and chair the session.
Thanks so much, Matthew. Just to say, it's a personal pleasure, deeply founded tonight, to welcome William Mann. It's going to be a great opportunity to catch up with a philosophy and a material will that seems to me to be now most mature, and in the firm Witherford Watson Mann, producing some great architecture. It goes back for me to 1985, where I was responsible for admitting William to Cambridge to study architecture. And I remember distinctly that in his first year, he had the confidence to put up an exhibition of drawings, of which I still own one. The very beautiful charcoal landscape drawings, particularly. And the combination of the hand and the mind, who came with a formidable classical training, had the foundations to create an intellectual ground for the practice as it goes on. So I'm really looking forward to this, and indeed to the questions that will no doubt follow. So William, over to you.
Great. Well, thanks, Eric, for that generous introduction. Thanks very much to London Met and to Eric Parry Architects for hosting. And also a special thanks to José de Paiva, whose invitation prompted me to put these thoughts together last year. Could we have the first slide, please? So I'm going to talk about 4 theatres, 2 by others and 2 by us. And through these buildings, I'll explore how buildings accommodate this sort of volatile substance of life, and a question that interests us a lot in the studio, how that plays out in time. So next slide, please. So there are 2 theatre projects that are somewhat iconic of 1960s London. I'm only going to speak of them to frame the first of my examples. On the left, so to speak, Cedric Price and Joan Littlewood's unbuilt Fun Palace, like a large piece of stage machinery in which, in Price's words, theatres, cinemas, restaurants, workshops, rally areas can be assembled, moved, rearranged and scrapped continuously. And to the right, Dennis Larsdon's National Theatre, a ziggurat in reinforced concrete. To paraphrase in one contemporary description, not only a huge, inflexible, hard to demolish building, but a huge, inflexible, hard to demolish institution. And in between this sort of restless stage engine and the immobile monument, there's a third project, a bit less well known, which interests me because it opens up other time signatures for the relation of theatrical performance to theatre building, and also of a relation of performance to the city. Bill Howell and Frank Dunlop's Young Vic. And it gives an interesting response to a question that was posed in 1904 by William Archer as he puzzled over how to turn the ambition of a national theatre that had already been knocking about for 60 years, how to turn that ambition into reality. And he asked, which comes first, the theatre company or its building? By which he meant, do you establish a company of actors, stage some plays, if they're successful, you build them a home? Or do you build a theatre and only then hire some actors and hope they grow into it? Next, please. This is more than a chicken and egg conundrum. It's about the difficult translation between the most ephemeral and the most durable forms of culture, between performance and building. And then this difficult translation is emblematic of the untimeliness that is inherent to all buildings, where, because buildings are expensive and inert, we find ourselves improvising new uses for leftover structures, and where conversely new buildings seem for a brief moment to offer us almost unlimited freedoms until we build them, when they then trap us within our own limited imagination of the future. So whether they're too early or too late, buildings are always slightly out of sync with their users and certainly with their makers. And my 4 examples break this large denomination idea into the small change of everyday experience. Next, please. So to start with the Young Vic, 65 years on from Archer's question, after dozens of productions, 1 temporary structure, 3 architects, 4 foundation stones, 1 funeral service held by mocking theatre critics, a national theatre company was finally in place, playing at the Victorian Old Vic Theatre near Waterloo Station, operating from offices in a chain of Nissen huts on a bomb site nearby, and a new purpose-built building was under construction on the South Bank. So all was good. Company, tick, building, on the way. Next. Except the company was playing on 1 stage and the new building would have 3. It needed more actors and a bigger audience. And not just more, but different, younger ones. Laurence Olivier, the director and leading actor, knew that he needed to make some space for the younger actors in his large shadow. The central nucleus of the company need encouraging to grow, to become illustrious themselves, as the old lot go the way of old flesh. Unless I can keep exciting in these people this sense of growth, I shall lose them. Upon this ancillary theatre depends the very future of the National Theatre itself. For Frank Dunlop, it was about the audience. They always talked about what they wanted to do. I said, oh, okay, but we've got to start considering the audience of the future. Olivier and Dunlop agreed to build a home for the young actors and the young public in a matter of months in 1970 as a temporary structure on a short-term lease. In playful homage to its older sibling, they called it the Young Vic. Next, please. They were offered a 5-year lease on a bomb site 100 metres along the street from the Old Vic, and they appointed Howell, Killick, Partridge and Amis to design the theatre, with a budget of £60,000, about £1 million in today's money. Half from the Arts Council, the other half from the National Theatre's reserves. Pretty bold. That definitely wasn't enough for any over-elaboration or even for any finishes. As Dunlop said, just what I want, instant warehouse. Next, please. HKPA retained the butcher's shop at the centre of the plot, a typical London terrace house 5 metres wide, highlighted in red here. They used it as entrance, box office, toilets, offices, locating the cafe, dressing rooms and large rehearsal space in a block to the left, and putting the theatre to the right, a half cube, square in plan, but with chamfered corners. Next, please. Its articulation had shades of the austere 1950s and hints of the flashier 1970s. When shown the architect's elevations, Dunlop said, "Good God, it looks like a gasworks with flags on it." But come to think of it, that's probably how the Globe looked. Next. It was framed in a steel skeleton and infilled with breeze block walls, while the external box truss spanning the 20 metres from street to stage, like a Bailey bridge, divided the square plan into smaller bays. It was done with extreme economy of means and no small amount of wit. The volume sketched out by the steel portals was like a spidery double of the butcher's shop. Through the rhymes of mass and lightness, of the found and the makeshift, their accidental coupling feels a natural fit. The relation between street and stage was incredibly direct, without anything more of a foyer than the old butcher's shop and the small bar half a level down. The pavement was the place that the public gathered before shows, took a breath in the interval, and lingered afterwards. It showed a compelling relation to the city that was different to the dominant model of the time. Post-war London was being reshaped from top to toe by teetotal pleasure haters and art-loving temple builders. Arts institutions like the National Theatre or the Royal Shakespeare Company were locating themselves in enclaves like the South Bank or the Barbican Arts Centre, elevated or sunk away from traffic, cushioned from the noise and conflict of everyday life. Expediency led the Young Vic to occupy a streetfront site rooted in the rhythms of the city. Next, please. As a performance space, the theatre was intimate and focused, with a capacity of 400. The rake seating was on 3 sides of the sunken central stage, and the shallow balcony was propped on single columns tied back to the walls. So the audience enclosed the performers, and no seat on the thick wooden benches was more than 6 metres from the stage. In its first years, Molière's Scapin, Stoppard's Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, and Lloyd Webber's Joseph all made a big mark with their irreverent energy. The Who tapped into this, attempting to escape the limitations of rock, playing a series of free events there in early 1971, described by Pete Townsend as a fiction or a play or an opera, where the audience will be completely involved in the music. While the Young Vic was artistically bold and independent, it was financially dependent on the National. With construction costs spiralling for Larsdon's building and a new director replacing the ailing Olivier, the Young Vic was abruptly cast into independent existence in 1975, before the National Theatre had even been completed. And it was granted an extended lease from the GLC. Over the 29 years beyond its planned 5-year lifespan, the Young Vic company built an audience and an identity out of the directness of its building. Next, please. Until they finally replaced the temporary theatre in 2004 with an evolution of the original octagonal space. The butcher's shop was once again retained, but its spidery cousin was swept away. So the Young Vic story is a journey from nothing to something in a structure that repeats itself in my other examples. There's a found structure that's adapted, the butcher's shop. There's a makeshift temporary structure added, the steel skeleton and blockwork shell. The company, the National Theatre, shapes the building. The building then shapes a new company, the Young Vic. It also exposes interesting uncertainties about where performance belongs within the city, bucking the antiseptic trend of its times. Next, please. My second example, the theatre opened in Shoreditch in 1576. It was built at a distance from the city, reflecting anxiety about plague and contagion. New legislation tied down companies of players that had previously been ephemeral and homeless, forcing them to find a patron and a home. Next, please. Could I have the next image, please? Thank you. The theatre was deliberately classical, both in form and in name. Oh, sorry, you've gone one too far. Must be the weight and the time lag, not to worry. Okay, so it was deliberately classical, both in form and in name, reflecting flourishing interest in Greek and Roman drama. But it is classical only in a mongrel fashion. It's hard to tell whether it was a mistranslation of a Roman theatre or just a very free interpretation. For the Romans built their theatres with a semicircle of raked seating facing a high stage wall, as Palladia's woodcuts of Vitruvius, just arrived in England, would have shown. The model that his own Teatro Olimpico followed just 4 years later, with a kind of archaeological precision, but also a strange shift of scale. Next, please. The Shoreditch Theatre was instead probably a 14-sided polygon, an approximation of a cylinder with an external diameter of 21 metres. It had a flat central floor open to the elements and 3 tiers of shallow galleries around, with a timber skeleton on a brick plinth plastered on the exterior. Its classical pretensions, which more or less amount to its cylindrical form and its name, were well understood. Contemporaries referred to it as the Romanish theatre. Next, please. It was built amongst the remains of the Holywell Priory. When the priory was dissolved in 1539 by Henry VIII's commissioners, its land and buildings were divided up between various nobles, merchants and cronies. Its bakehouse and brewhouse stayed active, making use of the clean water from the spring that had previously fed the Holy Well. The theatre was built in the backyard of this brewhouse, used as the bar. The construction cost £700 and they started playing in it before it was finished, since its financing was precarious. The land was on a short lease of 20 years. James Burbage, actor and joiner, useful combination in this case, was the prime mover, financed by his brother-in-law. Next, please. Kidd's Spanish Tragedy was probably played there, possibly Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, and a number of Shakespeare's mid-career plays, including Richard II, The Merchant of Venice, and Hamlet. Companies came and went, formed and reformed. Leicester's, Pembroke's, the Admiral's, Oxford's, the Queen's, and the Lord Chamberlain's men all played there. Next, please. But something must have been seen to work, because within 6 months, a rival playhouse had been built 100 metres to the south at Curtain Close. Rectangular in plan, 16 by 20 metres, probably built within an existing tenement. Any rivalry that there was soon turned into cooperation, and the two playhouses operated in tandem, sharing profits. This ended when Burbage's sons were unable to agree an extension of the lease, so in 1598 they dismantled the timber skeleton of the theatre and reassembled it south of the river with an extra 2 or 4 bays as the Globe, which lasted another 40 years. Next, please. The parallels with the Young Vic 4 centuries later are clear. A site cleared by destruction, dissolved monasteries were the bomb sites of the 16th century. It was a remnant structure that was retained, the old brew house. A new performance space in a skeletal construction, and a double act with a neighbouring theatre. The theatre and the curtain just like the Young and the Old Vic. The correspondences also reinforce the knowing but willful brilliance of Bill Howell, literate in the Shakespearean theatre, able to remake it with great freedom rather than plodding literalness. Its temporary character removing what Howell called inhibiting thoughts about building for posterity. In short, the limitations bred a kind of freedom. Next, please. My third example, Nevill Holt Opera, has followed a similar exchange of energy between company and building, from the tentative and fragile to the durable in a sequence of actions. The first steps were 15 years ago, when an established company, Grange Park Opera, were invited to bring one of their productions. A scaffold theatre was built inside the courtyard with a 12-year planning consent, and it went well enough that they returned year after year. And these productions built up enough of an audience, next please, that it didn't seem outrageous to set up an opera company for the 2-week summer festival. This was established 7 years ago, under the direction of the energetic Nick Chalmers, and still operating in the scaffold theatre. The company built up its artistic reputation by spotting and hiring talented young singers. Its audience grew, and so did the managerial and technical capacity, such that when the tented scaffold started to leak and creak and its planning consent had run out, they convinced the owner of the estate to invest in a permanent home for Nevill Holt Opera. Next. The found space we started with was good. An old stable courtyard in rough ironstone, 24 metres by 16 metres, peppered with tall, ornate doorways in awkward locations, but with this incredible warmth of colour and a really suggestive quality. Next. Our first design was for an independent timber frame with a ring of posts set in from the 4 walls supporting a trussed carpentry roof. We speculated that in time this frame could be dismantled and reassembled elsewhere as a freestanding theatre. As although the new theatre was intended as a permanent home for the opera, reversibility is an axiom of intervening in historic buildings, a kind of temporariness. Next. We responded to the found condition of the stone room, extending the volume of the walls vertically upwards and making an intimate space for performance defined by the U-shaped balcony and 2 freestanding piers forming a proscenium. And we responded also to this broader framing of earth and sky, keeping a perimeter around the walls at ground level, excavating the stalls and the orchestra pit inside this perimeter, and enclosing the courtyard, but leaving a large central opening. We wanted to make something of the intimacy and unity of the early Renaissance theatres, where court poets and musicians misremembered the Greek chorus as opera. Next. So this is our dim misremembering of how stage and seating coexist in a single room at Sabbionetta, before theatres became two rooms with a window in between. As at the Young Vic and the theatre, there was a found structure and a new construction. But in the end, we chose to entangle the found and the new, to allow the old stone walls as direct a presence as possible and to avoid the visual noise of two structures. So we built the new roof off the stone walls, supporting only the balconies of steel columns around the perimeter of the stalls. Next, please. We kept the balcony off the stone walls and shaped its edges to respond to the doorways and the large arched entrance. We even kept the proscenium away from the walls. And the stage just has the same stone walls at its edge as the auditorium, reinforcing the sense that the performers and the audience are in one room. The textures and tones of stone and wood and concrete have unexpected correspondences and read together as a whole, reinforcing the sense of the theatre as an enclosed exterior. Next. It's a pastoral, stately environment, not the raw energy of the street, but the relation from outside to in is still very direct. Like the original Young Vic or the theatre, there isn't a foyer, just gardens and marquees, so you step in from the outside very directly into the theatre. Next. Equally, there isn't a curtain dividing stage and auditorium, so you come into the theatrical space and the stage set is there. I think that this unity brings the performers closer to the audience and the audience closer to the performers. But it also heightens the occasion for the public, who gather before a performance against the Gothic doorways worthy of the stage set, under the warm daylight of the central roof light. And when the blind closes the roof light and the stage lights go up, one performance stops and the other one starts. Next. In the last season, for Britain's Midsummer Night's Dream, the public entered in the dark, and at the end of the opera, daylight flooded in from the roof light, and the stage doors were flung open, and the landscape outside merged with the space of the opera. So the immediacy of connection to the outside was used to shape the perception of time, demarcating and relating performance and everyday time. Next. In this exchange of energy between buildings and companies, shaping the building is the visible part, shaping the company is indirect and not seen. A key part of the work was to build up the energy of this growing opera festival, whose focus on young singers is backed up by their work with a network of schools. The intimate scale and the acoustic warmth of stone and wood walls supports the young voices, and the young company has made this challenging but versatile stage their own. Next. My last example, the Albany in Deptford, is already in its third incarnation and is now considering how to make its next evolution. The Albany Institute was created as a charitable foundation to support this dockside community. It was built in 1899 on a site created by road widening at the angle junction of the main highway and a side street. A grand building squeezed between terrace houses and a corner pub. Living up to its name through its institutional feel, utilitarian with tall windows regularly puncturing the thick brick walls, described by a later user as fortress-like. And at the top, on the second floor, was a two-story high hall, about 12 by 18 meters. Next. This large hall, with a stage and a gallery, hosted dances and festive meals, boxing and religious services. But there wasn't really a theatre, and there certainly wasn't a company. The performance space was the counterculture introduction. In 1966, Paul Curnow, a social worker, became director and gradually set up a programme of arts-based social action. He describes going around knocking on doors saying, "I've just been appointed as director of this building up the road. Do come and look at it. It's vast and there's nothing going on there. What would you like to see going on?" In 1972, Curnow advertised for 2 arts workers, and the radical theatre group based in Brighton, the Combination, responded and were appointed, transferring the whole company to Deptford, taking up residence at the Institute and transforming it profoundly. The Combination were trying to completely deconstruct theatre and reconstruct it again, to reach a young working class audience, taking performance out to the street and drawing on topical local issues. In Jenny Harris's words, "We could be anything, a mural, a disco, a rock band, a play, or a 10-minute piece of agitprop, who could animate a community to perform their own piece." Next, please. And they adapted the top floor hall, installing a steep raked scaffold theatre there, a semicircular sea around the stage at the centre of the long side, with a bar in the space. They renamed it the Albany Empire to catch a bit of the music hall spirit. And they played versions of Ubu, Aristophanes, new plays by Howard Brenton, Fay Weldon, and site-specific works like Watch It All Come Down by John Turner, about redevelopment and the demolition industry, topical in the extreme in 1970s Deptford, being torn down and rebuilt in a lengthy state of limbo. In the words of one of the stage designers, the thing that was special about the Albany was it had a bar in the space. Well, it was to the side, but I mean, it was in the theatre space. And the idea was the theatre sort of hugged the audience and they could smoke. And it was always the case that you'd have your bit of theatre and then at the end, you'd have the treat, which would be that you'd then have like a disco and you could let your hair down all in the same space and food. And you could chat while it was on. So it was pretty raucous, rough theatre. Next, please. It was a further road widening scheme to Creek Road in the 1970s that led to the demolition of the old Albany Institute and forced the relocation of the Albany to a new building up the High Street in Douglas Way, designed by the architects of the Young Vic, Howell, Killick, Partridge and Amos, and completed in 1981. Now, where the old Institute had been vertically stacked on a plot with 2 party walls and 2 street fronts, the new Albany was spread horizontally over 90 metres on a standalone site. It was a mix of the domestic and the theatrical, the character deliberately non-institutional. Its scale echoes the 2-storey cottages opposite. The pitched roofs are timber-framed, domestic but angular in feel. Transparent on the inside with open galleries overlooking the central cafe, it's heavier on the outside. And that creative energy has always been more apparent inside than out. Next, please. The plan is like a figure of 8 with an open link, a figure of 9. The theatre at the centre of one end is wrapped on 4 sides by ancillary spaces, so that's the theatre on the right, and then the other, open end on the left, west end, encloses the garden, and at the centre between those 2 is the cafe. Next, please. The theatre itself was a fruitful hybrid of HKPA's attachment to the Elizabethan Courtyard Theatre and the combinations to Music Hall. It's a 20-sided polygon, 18 by 14 metres, flat-floored, with 1 balcony, whose supporting steel columns bend to form a raking ceiling. And of course, it has a bar at the back. It's intimate and versatile, usable for performances and gigs in a wide range of formats. So, after 10 years in Deptford, the Combination had a new stage, tailored instead of improvised, housed in a non-institutional setting that they themselves had helped shape. But 10 years is a long time in the theatre and also in politics. Curnow, the director, had moved on as early as 1973. Tensions with the community programme simmered. Arts Council funding for community arts was substantially reduced in 1981. Key personalities left in 1985, and the Albany limped on and under the Combination until 1990, before it lost its Arts Council funding completely and teetered on the brink. Next, please. It was revived around the millennium, and since 2002 has been run under Chief Executive Gavin Barlow, not as a producing house, but more as a social enterprise, hosting the diverse energies of the area. As Gavin said, coming here, you had all that history, but no structural guiding philosophy, just a building. We set about shifting the model. Looking at the building, things were being given away for free. We had to work more like a social enterprise. We have lots of office space, digital equipment and workshops, and we started renting them out to community and artistic organisations. From these resident organisations, new initiatives and collaborations have emerged, like Meet Me at the Albany, arts animated daycare for isolated older people. Although we're not funded as a producing venue, at least 60% is work generated specifically from this building. So in other words, the Albany as it exists now has grown to fit the strengths and particularities of the building. Next, please. The first iteration of the Albany was a philanthropic institution with a hall. In the second, it gained a performance space in the 1970s with the arrival of a resident theatre company and the insertion of a scaffold theatre. The third iteration was the new building opened in 1982, shaped by the combination to reflect an ideal of community and the arts. So for this fourth incarnation of the Albany, we aren't starting from scratch. There's a strong and purposeful Albany organisation. There are loyal and engaged publics, and the inherited structures are not only useful, but also transmit the spirit of the institution. As architects, we're not so much authors writing on a blank page as editors drawing together multiple stories. Next. We've been working together on this transformation since 2012, trying to find a path that enables profound change with modest means. We've imagined this as a metamorphosis, like when a crustacean breaks out of its old shell and grows or finds a new one. Next. We have to demolish, but we also have to retain. The main theatre is much loved and built to last, and it's only sensible to keep it. And there isn't much scope to build higher on the street, nor is there benefit in knocking down what is still serviceable, only to have to pay today's rates to rebuild it. So we keep the streetfront building, the old craft studios, long since used as offices and meeting rooms. Next. Retention means the new building will inevitably be mongrel, a mix of the inherited and the new, like my other examples. We add a second performance space, top left. We reshape the cafe that's at the heart of the Albany at the moment, drawing it forwards right to the street. And we cluster the other spaces around the theatre in a horseshoe. Next. Where before 2/3 of the site was occupied by the Albany and 1/3 was unbuilt, now the Albany will occupy half the site and housing will occupy the other half. Next. What interests us here is how this closed, introverted building could become more enmeshed again with the city around. Next. For example, with a cafe and co-working space that connect right through to the street market. Next. And a garden which is part of, but apart from, the network of streets and parks, and a studio theatre that opens out to the courtyard. Next. So it will be a warp and weft of creators and theatres, no longer defensive and inward facing, but instead extrovert, no longer singular, but instead multiple, a deliberately mongrel building, a hybrid of an inherited structure, forcibly broken open, and a new one whose open forms are enmeshed with street, court, and square. In a sense, making it more like its older cousin, the original provisional Young Vic, with a misremembered dash of Fun Palace. Next. So our design is thought both as an end result and as a sequence. But one substantial challenge of designing for incremental change is how to keep the existing institution going, keeping its staff employed and keeping its public entertained and loyal. Even when there isn't a company, this is difficult. This is not so much chicken and egg as keeping a patient alive while you perform surgery. So at Nevill Holt, they performed for one summer season in a tent in the grounds, and that set the 20-month time frame for the construction project. Our idea for the Albany was that the new studio theatre would be built first, as this series of phasing diagrams illustrates, and could be up and running while the main theatre was refurbished, with a further sequence of constructions and decantings. We thought this was quite an ingenious set of chess moves, until Gavin phoned up shortly afterwards to say there was a possibility of getting a grant to refurbish the theatre first, which we placed last. So it was a bit like starting the end game with your queen rather than your knight. Next, please. So 5 years ago, that's where we started, with a light touch refurbishment of the theatre, making new temporary seating platforms that fit the polygon, after 30 years with a square peg and a polygonal hole, reinstating the metallic paint on the steel frame, making new balcony balustrades, bringing out its mix of music hall bling and Elizabethan warmth. This work didn't unlock the next move, but it deepened the trust and understanding that we and the Albany will need for the bigger project. And in that sense also, the cultural and the built can't be neatly separated. Next, please. So to conclude, there are some simple threads that link these four very different projects. First of all, spatial qualities, the theatrical force of immediacy, because the buffer between inside and outside is minimal. In the case of the Young Vic, the theatre and the Albany, that outside is the street, surely a richer energy source than the arts enclave. Next. Second, the enduring power of theatrical intimacy, expressed in the proximity and unity of actors and audience. Next. And third, they show the ebb and flow of theatrical life, with company and building opportunistically shaping each other, often out of sync, then settling into fixity, and as times change, losing momentum before a new company or a new energy takes root in the found structure. In this complex exchange of energy between performance and building, there are several time signatures that emerge. The buildings are frequently a mix of the leftover, the provisional, and the misremembered. The leftover structure is a sign of the rapid growth of capacity, the need for a base, the absence of funds, the logic of making do. The butcher's shop, the Priory brew house, the old stable courtyard, the street front studios, these are all redundant from their original use, but still good to serve. So like a hermit crab inhabiting a sea snail's shell, they're put to use. The provisional is a product of fast construction and precarious land ownership. The Young Vic's 5-year lease, the theatre's 20-year lease led to their skeletal form, the archetype of fast enclosure. And misremembered because in these projects, the theatrical spirit of ancient Rome, Renaissance Italy, Elizabethan and 60s London are misremembered and loosely reinvented. Here, the architect can learn from the actor or director, for whom there is no invention, only reinvention, and casual disregard and deep respect can coexist. So this exchange of energy between companies and buildings and publics and buildings again is an exchange of energy weighted with time. Leftovers embraced, acts that are provisional or misremembered, preserve the energy of performance in ways that monuments and stage machines don't. Like it or not, the theatre architect works with the ephemera and residues. And the buildings we make are therefore untimely, always a bit out of sync. It's my conviction that if we learn to work with, not against these time lags, trusting in how buildings learn, we can best nurture the fragile energies of the performers, and companies who trust us with their homes. And this durable provisional spirit has much to recommend it far beyond the specific conditions of the theatre. Thank you.
And thank you, William, hugely. The cycles are extraordinary. I have to say that as a second-year student, I remember coming to London to speak to Bill Howell about the Young Vic that had just been open for a year, and because we were doing a theatre at the architecture school, and that phrase the gasworks with flags on it was played back in an amazing way. He's a very powerful figure, you know, indomitable, and so wonderful to listen to that and the thread of new and old, and the recycle of powerful ideas, and how the flame lives on so well. So over to others. I think Christian was going to take up the first question, I'm right in saying, or is it Nicholas first and then open to the floor?
I'm happy to start. Thank you for that, William. It was really interesting. I suppose I have a particular interest in theatre, in festival theatre particularly, and its origins in the streets and places of the city. And I was struck by, at one point in the Nevill Holt Opera, where you talked about the daylight suddenly, in a sense, re-engaging. And it made me think of promenade performance as opposed to seated performance, which it seemed to me that Nevill Holt Opera wasn't perhaps quite so good at as the Deptford version, but had this. The part of the promenade aspect of concerts or performances is often this, as you talk about, this lack of a foyer, this lack of an intermediate space that connects it or disconnects it from the street. And linked in with that, obviously, historically, when you bring the Elizabethan theatres in, they're not allowed in the centre of the city because they're places of disrepute. Actors are untrustworthy because they spend their whole life being other people, and so they don't have the same kudos as the theatrical or thespians do today. And so that sort of city peripheral vision, which is perhaps a bit closer to the Old Vic and the Deptford theatre, are very interesting parts of the theatres that you talk about. And what was really interesting, I thought, about your talk was you talk about the spatial sequences, which are quite local. So you'll talk about the entrance or the spaces just outside, but I was wondering a little bit more about beyond that. So for example, Deptford Theatre in Kensington, or you know, the way in which some of the impact of the local communities or that you're talking about maybe had some broader impact on the spatial sequences of entrance and threshold, because often foyers can be the most intimidating part of the theatre. That stop people going in. If people just wander in, then they can just experience something immediately. So was there any sense that the different theatres that you talked about had do you think were influenced by their location within the city, apart from just their local aspect of it, and whether in fact the promenade aspect of it, which for me is perhaps the most urban part of the performance, also forms a part of that sequence of spatial events.
Okay, very interesting. I mean, I suppose the topography of the city is varied and physically and socially and economically, so you'd expect spaces of any sort, performance spaces, to kind of inflect to that. I mean, I guess what's interesting is the Shakespearean or Elizabethan playhouses were kept out of the city, but there was at the Blackfriars Hall. There were a number of venues where players played under kind of aristocratic or even royal patronage as a fortune. So as a standalone typology, the theatres were excluded then either in Shoreditch or in Bankside, but as they're just part of the warp and weft of courtyards and large halls, they were kind of integrated. So in that sense, maybe that distinction is less sharp. Equally, I mean, I guess the promenade thing's an interesting one. The Royal Opera House in the 70s used to clear the seats out of the stalls and hold promenade concerts. So in that sense, I guess that's something that's inherent to the building, and it's just a bit of bolting and unbolting, or a lot of bolting and unbolting of seats. And it seems to me it's a lost opportunity that it's not practiced more frequently or more vigorously. I mean, I guess the energies that a kind of theatre gets from both its location in terms of the character of an area, but I think above all, even in Kensington, it's like if it was right on for the theatre, you had that degree of directness, I think it would have a totally different energy, and it has a totally different sort of sense of buffering, and in a way that some of that buffering, I think you're right, it does have some sort of I mean, it has economic purposes, but also has a kind of sending out some subtle messages. So I'd say that directness is something that probably is relevant, or would be an interesting thing to try wherever you were in the city. But maybe it does hold a different kind of energy and a different kind of opportunity in the periphery.
Thank you. Moving, Nicholas, are you up for a question, or do we open it up?
I have got a question. One of the things, William, I thought was quite interesting in the beginning of your lecture, you talked about how buildings have a danger of trapping us in our imagination of the future, which I thought was a really interesting kind of idea. And in a sense, your concept of this notion of misremembering, the provisional nature of theatre as part of this process, the kind of almost precariousness, if you like, of theatre as a kind of way of existing or coexisting within the city, and how that also provides this sense in which of misremembering, or memory is something which is always open to the imagination, and somehow kind of a process of reinvention, if you like, of the past. Can you tell us a little bit about your own philosophical approach to theatre itself, not just the architecture, but how you understand that in the context of this notion of temporality of building?
Interesting. I mean, I suppose, yeah, thanks, Nick. There's a very beautiful long poem by Bertolt Brecht called About or How to Build Enduring Works. And he says something, and it's almost like it's conversational. He says, works endure as long as they're not finished. And I suppose there's in that sense, the theatre is perhaps something that's emblematic, or an art form, and an interaction with buildings that is kind of particularly, I suppose it's particularly pointed, but that sense of the unfinished business feels like it's kind of relevant more broadly. And was it probably was it the 90s or something that they started looking at changes to the National Theatre, and Larsdon did a feasibility study for adapting and extending his own building, and he produced this odd and interesting design, which is a canvas tent located on the terrace, because I suppose his view was, look, it's almost perfect and we can't extend it its own language, we have to kind of add to it in a kind of totally different syntax. And Peter Brook, who'd been on the commissioning panel for the National Theatre, and then in a way walked away, articulated a very different point of view, which is that he said something like a theatre is, should be like an airport that gets rebuilt every, dismantled and rebuilt every generation. I mean, I suppose what, I don't know what I can or should say about the theatre, because it's just such a broad subject, but in terms of how that engages with our approach to building and to the life that buildings host, it's an interesting one, because I suppose we both as a thinking exercise and as a kind of communicative exercise, because having sort of fiddled with old buildings, perhaps we start to be seen as sort of heritage architects, or I suppose architects who conserve and maintain. And I suppose the theatre is an interesting sort of jolt of electricity to that practice and that idea that it's about forwards motion. I think it was Gustav Mahler who said that tradition is the preservation of fire, not the worship of ashes. And I guess, sometimes we go and we're the really polite people who sort of fiddle and tinker and don't do very much, at the same time hoping that that can unlock profound change. Other places we sort of go in and people go, what? You're not going to do that to a monument, are you? So that is very much contextual. But yeah, this sort of place of the ephemeral, I guess, is an interesting prompt for us to work with this sort of extreme economy of means, and this to try and reconcile somehow that idea of the durable and the provisional.
Thank you. I'm sure we have some guests from far, like Alberto, Pérez-Gómez. We have David Leatherbarrow, old friends. We have Peter Carl. Can I ask if anyone wants to? I can't see so directly, but if there's an open invitation to participate, please.
Well, I could perhaps just continue the conversation that was started, because that's my line of questioning. I'm extremely impressed by this work, William, that I don't know. I'm far away, and I wish I could experience your buildings. And I think they're obviously very beautiful. I would love to see them in action. But the big question for me as a historian is my awareness of the connection between the theatre as a almost paradigmatic architectural institution in terms of what it represents about public participation coming through the Western tradition, from the Greeks, the Romans, etc., and how, as you know well, the theatre changes basically, fundamentally, radically, I would say, in terms of its social implications between the 18th and the 19th century. And so you are dealing with something very particular, which is Elizabethan, mostly and it's important to maintain the possibility of these artifacts actually being enacted and playing a role in our culture. But I guess the questions that were asked by our colleagues go in that direction is how would you see this problem? Because of course, you were mentioning Peter Brook. I mean, he's very aware of this problem. The relevance of the theatre really has to do with its cultural presence, and it's not an unchanging historical phenomenon. It's something that moves through time. Today, some would argue that the theatre has not much relevance in our cultural imagination. So I think one would have to. I would like to hear you. What do you think about that? Since you've been working with theatres all your life, I guess that's yeah.
Thanks, Alberto. I mean, that's interesting. No, indeed. I'm certainly not suggesting there's a fixed archetype of the theatre. In a way, it's interesting. I suppose that's this idea of misremembering. I mean, what is it? At the Pnyx in Athens, they would have something like 15,000 people at the Pan-Athenaeum Festival.
Yes.
I mean, crazy. And then what is it? Palladio kind of, and of course, I guess that gets translated. It gets the sine frons with the Romans, and they build it in all the kind of provincial kind of towns, like this wet provincial cities like Chester. And then what Palladio kind of, to pick a name at random, sort of picks it up, and the Teatro Olimpico is like a, what is it, 1 to 10 model or something. At the same time, when it was opened, and I think they opened it with Aeschylus, they had something like 3,000 or 4,000 people in there, which is like, how? And I guess so then this, yeah, I suppose it seems to me you can probably trace this kind of forward motion, or even if it's not forwards, there's an emotion and this change, and certainly the evolution to the opera house, and in a way this thing where with the proscenium and the set proscenium and the gigantic, big stage machinery and the like. I think it was Inigo Jones who, was it Ben Jonson and Inigo Jones who had a spat, and Ben Jonson, the playwright, said he thinks his sets, he thinks they've come to look at his sets, not my play. So I guess certainly the Renaissance and Jones is an interesting and that his contemporaries are an interesting kind of period where the spectacle takes over from the participation. I mean, what's interesting though is, and was it Ian McIntosh was very interesting about this. He claimed that almost like every even 18th and 19th century theatre has had the forestage cut off in order to fit some more seats in, or to make an orchestra pit. An orchestra pit's Wagner's invention at Bayreuth. Before that, I'm not sure where the musicians were, but they weren't hidden away. And then what's interesting to come to Brooke is that with the selection panel of the National Theatre, he was accused. He said that of someone else said, "Oh, Brooke he'd be perfectly happy with a bomb site in Bethnal Green." And so, funnily enough, he ended up with a bomb site at next to the Gare du Nord, this sort of ruined theatre. But what's interesting in relation to this, so although this kind of settling of the theatre from one room into two rooms, which I guess you sort of see in the sort of from the 16th to the 19th centuries, is kind of very strong and increasingly strong, and then with fire you then get this big steel sheet that kind of cuts the two apart. What's interesting is the people who pick at that, whether it's Ian McIntosh with restorations of existing theatres or Peter Brooke with transgressions and challengings, what they both do, the first thing they do is they bring the stage further out into the auditorium. Mm-hmm. And suddenly that can change the energy. So I don't know, the numbers, the sort of size of some of these things, the acoustics, all kind of play their role. But this kind of ideal of the one room is a kind of beautiful, beautiful ideal, but it probably isn't something that can be maintained for everything. But even, when you have two rooms, if there's a way, and I'm sure there always is, that you can step out and you make a threshold between them, and I guess that's the forestage, or the forestage and the stalls. Suddenly, I think, this separation can be overcome, and the possibilities of something more participatory and live emerge. I mean, the interesting thing, I guess, in terms of numbers and scale is that, certainly it seems that the studio theatres in London are the ones that have the most energy and the best plays. And in a way, you almost have to sign up, of course, because there are only 400 seats or something, you have to sign up blind to get a ticket. You can't wait until you read a review. But then I guess the West End theatres then, if something's really successful, it'll transfer and have a 6-month run or a 1-year run beyond that. So there's a bit of an ecology as well in terms of these scales. I mean, I don't know, that's a very horseback kind of reflection on these things, but because I guess, you know, now a lot of them in London prior to lockdown were doing musicals, you know, the big spectacles that I guess were doing musical, variety, operetta, whatever. It's now just musicals, but yeah, I guess the live experience is still, and which we, you know, it's funny talking about this virtually, but the vigor and power of the live experience is still something that it feels like there's a huge place for, and it's a different exchange of energy with scale and with format, but yeah, it's still this sort of fundamental energy that we need.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Alberto. David, hi, please.
Thank you, Eric. I have a question about the opening of the talk, Architecture's Untimeliness.
Mm-hmm.
I like the opening phrase, too early and too late, but I wanted to ask when architecture is on time. I was really impressed by the stage doors opening. Struck me as, if you will, architecture's opportune moment. And I wonder if that has occurred to you in thinking through the project making, that not so much what the theater is, but what it does. Its responsiveness to things that were or were not foreseen, and that perhaps its body is sensitive enough to seize the opportunity and establish a condition that is of the moment, not before, not later, now. It is when the building plays its part. Not that parts are played in it, but it's one of the players in the performance. If there are other instances like the stage doors opening that you've had in mind in these projects, or perhaps in your study have noticed, is the timeliness of architecture.
Very interesting.
Momentary though it might be.
Yeah. I think I see. I mean, I suppose it's interesting. Yeah, no, you're right that buildings, because they take time, they're always a bit too late.
I mean they make time, not that they take, they make.
Yeah. One of the buildings that kind of made a big impression on me is the Parish church in Barakon, Tweed, which on the border between England and Scotland, and it's one of, I think, 3 churches built under the Commonwealth, under Cromwell, and it's a square box with touches of Inigo Jones, formatted like a theatre, but it was paid for with money that was raised by the previous king. It was built with remnants from monasteries and shipwrecks. So I think in a way we see this sort of slow accumulation. I mean, certainly in historic buildings. I guess in contemporary buildings, it tends to be easy to knock them down and start again, and therefore they lose that sense of time and in a way the awkwardness is that at Nevill Holt we had to deal with. I mean, there's all sorts of things at Nevill Holt you wouldn't do if you were starting from scratch. The balcony is higher than you'd set it in order not to cut across the doorways, but that actually makes the rear stall seats well connected visually and acoustically. So it feels like actually there's a set of, dozens of calibrated decisions that it's kind of quite similar to what you might choose to do on a freestanding site, but that are highly specific. I guess in terms of the possibilities, I mean, it's interesting. I suppose the sense of time within the space is kind of probably shaped. I was project architect on an opera house and concert hall in Bruges with Rob Rettendam, and we had in order to turn that from an opera house to a symphony hall, we had I think a 20 by 18-meter panel that was hung at the back of the stage and then tilted up with a hoist to kind of create a reverberation chamber behind the orchestra shell. And when I saw that, I thought, Jesus, that is stage engineering, you know. Architects should stick to doors and windows. So in terms of timeliness or how buildings going to respond to time, I think we're left with the stuff that doesn't move, which is stone, concrete. I mean, moving floors at the Pompidou, please, you know, come on. They haven't moved in 50 years. I mean, what is it, Maison du Peuple in Clichy, wonderful, but, you know, it's all kind of rusted and stuck. And so therefore, our opportunities to make these kind of openings and connections are kind of quite limited. They're doors and they're windows. And I guess the roof light is this beautiful thing that, which is quite an awkward thing to fit in an opera house, but because you also have to deal with rain drumming on it and this and that, but we managed to do that. So that's a blind. As you say, the stage doors, well, that was a complete surprise to us. We just did them so that you could get gear in and out, and it was a beautiful thing that you could open it and have this view of the trees. And then the stable doors. So in a way, I suppose what I would say is, yeah, so some of this we anticipated and we nurtured and we sort of said, oh, you could do this and you could do that. Others we just completely didn't expect. But I guess what I would say is that before you get into the cranes and the moving auditoria and the Fun Palace stuff, it's amazing what you can do with a big door or a blind. And those are the things that, in the right circumstances, can create this sense of, I guess it is sort of this collision of festive time and everyday time.
Thank you. Yeah, Peter, you're waiting. Peter, you're on mute still.
That's probably the way I should be for the rest of my life.
No, tragedy.
I think this has gotten to an interesting point. To me, theater is a subcategory of drama, and one finds drama almost everywhere. And using the phrase of Dagmar and Fallaci, the time out of time, you find yourself very quickly moving between something like theater, which became very introverted once it became an interior room. I was very intrigued by your last scheme. Just that I was going to go. As it happens, I've been working on Greek drama over the last few days, and I'm not going to get into that. I was just very intrigued by your last building, or your last interpretation of theater, since it seemed the architecture seemed to be able to, I don't know whether it's hybrid or not, I don't care. But it was using things like the street, it was using things like corridors and playing off them as if they were all sets, as if they were all places in which, you know, doing what you were doing became meaningful. So that when you came to the theater, it wasn't something you necessarily had to wear a tie or smoke weed, depending on which theater you're at. Though, of course, the degree to which you could have a nice meal or a symposium or a philosophical discussion after the meal or a food fight, or all, you know, the possibility for evil is of course one of the things that the theater really cultivates. You know, why go to nobody's going to go to a theater and watch somebody have a good time. And so the need for it to touch on evil, to touch on the chthonic, is part of it. And when it becomes sort of, and I think your attraction to theaters that are sort of coming into being and passing away, they're sort of like built ruins from day one, makes quite a bit of sense to me. But it's like the whole topic is wider, more violent, and less it's a matter of, I don't think the architecture is that important as everybody keeps saying. I just like a warehouse. You know, the telesterion is a bunch of columns, you know, it's or, you know, the mosque at Cordoba, and the degree to which drama and ritual overlap or conflict. These ways of creating time out of time. I mean, a football match, I mean, Christian's violent football match is a good example of how you combine real violence and injury with ritual or ceremony at least. And I think those modalities are when you're sort of in a condition of reflection, I think part of the problem with Bayreuth is that it became, this god-awful religion. I mean, there's moments of the music where I appreciate, but on the whole, Wagner should have been put in the pit along with the rest of it.
Well, again, the best football grounds, in my view, when I take my sons travelling, we do some football tourism, and you get different experiences and this and that. But in terms of the rake, the distance from the pitch, the kind of fan culture, which my son is kind of quite observant about, the difference between a supporter and a kind of spectator. But certainly the best football grounds, in my experience, are the ones which are sat in the middle of the city. So if you go to Fulham or Newcastle, it's just like you walk through the streets and you arrive there, and there isn't much space. The crowd management is a touch tricky. So it's actually precisely the same thing, is that there's the immediacy between this sort of, strange ritual of spending 90 minutes watching 0-0 draw, and just that kind of connection out to the city, which when you buffer it with a kind of big area of, we went to West Ham, the London Stadium, and it was the last day of Christmas shopping or something, so we get fed out through the car park, and you just lose all that sense of the drama that underlies the drama. So I think, yes, I think what you're touching on very kindly is that sort of question of the rooting in the city is the underdeveloped bit of this story, because and yet it's a kind of really fundamental one. And it's interesting, I suppose, the pastoral setting of Nevill Holt is a kind of, listen, that's also kind of a different tradition, or a different kind of more the courtly form of theatre making. But how these things sit in the city. I suppose my favourite image in all of that is the one of the National Theatre circa 1971, where you got the old Vic, the young Vic, the scene shop, the offices in the prison hut. This sense that actually it is an open system, both performance and production are kind of part of open systems that are woven into the city. That's kind of special and exciting. And when it all gets kind of concentrated and insulated from the rest of life, that's when we have to start worrying.
Yeah, one last point, a bit of history. I think the Propylaea on the Acropolis is the beginning of the Sine Frons. That's a completely unusual piece of architecture. I'd be interested if anybody objects to that or has other things to say. Send me an email. Don't bother with it here.
Yeah. Okay. So I think I can't see any other questions. I'm sure there are loads. Dagmar, please.
Oh, yeah. Well, if you're about to wrap up.
No, I think we have sort of, 10 minutes and I'm sure they're going to be incredibly fruitful, please.
Okay, well, anyway, I think it's really interesting how the atmosphere of architectural places affects what can be done there, the kind of activities, the kind of people that want to go there. And this is, I think your theatre, the Nevill Holt Opera place, looks just absolutely wonderful. I like opera, and we go frequently here in Edinburgh. You can go to the opera for 20 quid, and it's nice. It's kind of a rundown place. But still, people, I think, widely have this perception that that opera is somehow elitist, terribly expensive, and not quite for us. And it seems like your opera house would be the kind of place that would entice all sorts of people in. I don't know, perhaps the location makes that less likely, but... and
the ticket price.
The ticket price. Oh, yeah. But the atmosphere, that's something that Peter Brook talked about quite a lot at the Bouffe du Nord and so on, that you do need to have a certain decrepitude to to make things happen. I was just reminded, you said that the National Theatre was a very fixed building, but there was the shed that they built in the courtyard recently. Well, I don't think it's there anymore, but
temporary theatre during the rebuilding, exactly. Yeah. No,
yeah.
Indeed, that's another kind of element of that story.
We're really pleased with the kind of completely different type of person that they were able to attract into that red wooden box. Because of the type of performances, but mainly, I suppose, because the atmosphere was different. So I just wonder, in short, if you could say something about the kind of atmosphere that you aim for in your buildings, and what do you think is most fruitful in.
Interesting. I mean, I suppose it's interesting. I'll start with a digression, which I think I generally do. I suppose the little red box was an interesting one, because actually in format it wasn't so different to the Cottesloe or Dorfman. You know, it's basically, it is again a kind of courtyard theatre, very intimate, and I suppose what you're flagging up, which is interesting, is of course they did it as a red upside down chair on the public realm, and suddenly it has a different visibility. Larsdon put the original Cottesloe Theatre underneath the stage of the main stage of, I can't remember which auditorium, precisely so it couldn't be cut. So it's kind of buried, but in quite a deliberate and tactical way. And so then when they opened it, I think that wasn't even finished, and then they went to Ian McIntosh to fit it out as a performance space. I mean, listen, the atmosphere, it's interesting. I mean, we haven't done many unbuilt schemes for kind of theatres or opera houses, in a sense. It's quite a hard kind of field to break into. You have to kind of really earn your spurs as an architect to get a shout at that kind of work. But we did a scheme for the Royal Opera House for their competition kind of 8 years ago, and what was interesting there was this sort of vestige of the market, you know, the floral hall, which had been cut in half and lifted up and whatever. And I suppose that seemed to us a great possibility to sort of have that different kind of connection with the public space. And that was a bit their intent, and that's a bit what's happened. At the same time, of course, Covent Garden itself has just become this managed estate. So I suppose all in single ownership, quite remarkable. So I guess the performance and the performing arts institutions, I can't remember, what's the place in that opened in Manhattan recently, the Dillisca one. Yeah. Obviously at London City Island, at Canning Town, the English National Ballet has been located. There's this sort of sense of the trade-off of development and the arts is a interesting one, but I think I suspect the people who get involved in that should read Faust or Dr. Faustus, which take their pick. The atmosphere then, I guess, and we've had similar conversations around the Albany, and which I won't go into, but the autonomy of the architect shapes a bit of that. A lot of it's already there in the city. Hopefully a lot of it's already there in the building, and what you're able to do is pick and unpick, act, like I say, a bit more like an editor or a director, and then reopen this thing, and then create the sense of possibilities that the company and the actors can perform or can work with. And so in that sense, it depends, it varies hugely, doesn't it, what your starting point is. And I guess it's probably naive to think that you could make site-specific, a kind of totally site-specific work with each performance space you make, but that's got to be the direction.
Thank you. I think on that note, the one thing that's absolutely clear is that one needs a sense of difference in the city. That in theatre, like architecture, you know, that mix of formal and informal is incredibly important. It's, you know, in my mind, the fact that Peter Brook, after the misadventures of the National, came back and chose to bring his troupe from Paris to the Roundhouse in London was a singular sort of part of that experience of theatre in very different conditions. And like football teams, you need tribes, and you need tribes that take a different opinion, and that's part of the agon of the question of the city and the theatre. But William, thank you hugely for tonight. It's really rewarding architecturally and intellectually. Wonderful. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great.
Just to let everybody know that I'm putting the link to register for our next event, which is the Art of Urban Memory with speaker Vivian Lovell next month. I'm putting it in the chat. Do come along next time, and we'll see you then.
Thank you. Thanks, William.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.
Have a nice evening. Cheers.